everybody. Welcome to ARE Live. I'm Mark Tier, the founder of Black Spectacles, and today I'm with Mike Newman, and we're going to be discussing the Programming, Planning, and Practice exam, and in particular the mock exam that we issued yesterday. Before we get started, if you'd like to attend our next ARE Live broadcast, where we're going to be featuring recently licensed architects and how they passed all sections of their exams, you can register at blackspectacles.com/podcast. And during the broadcast, you'll have a chance to ask questions to the group as well as to Mike. We'll be actually featuring some different architects than we did last time. We did this about 3 or 4 months ago. It was a really interesting session. Everybody, I think, kind of takes a different angle on achieving licensure, so it's always good to hear a couple of different ways to do it. So it should be a good session. Now, if you don't know Mike, he's an adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also the founder of Shed Studio, and he is the instructor for Black Spectacles online AIA ARE Prep curriculum. If you haven't already checked out our ARE Prep curriculum, head over to blackspectacles.com to watch any of the free tutorials from the courses. And today we have a special Black Spectacles promo code to share at the end. And then also, at the end of today's episode, we'll choose someone from all the folks who submitted their answers to this mock exam, and they're going to win a free 1-month ARE plus software tutorials Black Spectacles membership. And we'll be tracking your answers for everyone who submitted. And for everyone who gets all of them right, we'll actually be sending out free Black Spectacles t-shirts to all of you. So we'll be tracking all of your answers, tracking Mike's correct answers here, and announcing them at the end as well. So make sure you stay tuned to the end for all those things. And lastly, tonight we'll be taking questions using the GoToWebinar question box here, as well as on Twitter using the ARE Live podcast hashtag. So make sure you use that if you have any questions you'd like to ask. So I guess at this point, let's hand it over to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Mark. As Mark said, we're going to be talking about Programming, Planning, and Practice, which is the ARE 4.0 version of the exam. A lot of this discussion actually will get under 5.0, will get distributed out through a number of the different topics under both the one regarding practice, the one regarding specific projects, and then also quite clearly the beginning phase 1 of the 4 that are in the sequence in a row. So we'll talk about that later. But let's just dive in. One of the things that I think is reasonable to say about Programming, Planning, and Practice is that this is one of those exams that is kind of a catch-all. That it's sort of there's a whole wide range of potential topics that can come from here, and you'll find there's a lot of crossover between construction documents and service, as well as site planning. Which, I mean, clearly site planning, programming, planning, and practice. Practice has a lot of stuff about kind of contracts and all of that. So obviously, even just from the words, you can tell there's a lot of overlap. They do come at these questions from slightly different angles, but you'll find that some people will often use the PPP as one to start with, because once you've studied for PPP, Programming, Planning, and Practice, that you'll find that you've already started your studying for some of the other ones. Other people will go the opposite way and kind of do it at the end, because once they've studied for everything else, they sort of have a lot of the studying done already. But that's the kind of thing you should start thinking about, is like, what's the strategy that I can employ? That I can employ when it comes to these things. But given that, let's just jump into our little session here. Okay. You and the client, this is the first question here. You and the client are unsure of how the bids are going to come back. The client is worried that the cost will be too high and will require redoing all the work to get all the bids that to fit their specific budget. And the question is asking, what should you suggest to the client? And we have 4 different possible answers. First one, nothing. It is contractually important that you do not get involved in bids or dollar amounts because you don't want to become liable for any problems. B, telling the bidders to bring their costs down, otherwise no one will get awarded the bid. C, create a bid form that includes add alternatives for portions of the work that are deemed not primary concern. Or D, create 2 bid forms and 2 sets of bid drawings such that one is simpler and cheaper, and then you can bid them out simultaneously. So as always, there are sort of aspects of rightness in many of the potential answers, but there's really only one that speaks to how the NCARB and AIA feel that you should be thinking about these things. And the answer is C, create a bid form that includes add alternatives. Now, that's one way to do it, is doing it through what's referred to as adds. The other way to do it is what's referred to as deducts, right? So it's the same basic idea. Either I start with the whole thing and then say, but also give us a price if we didn't do the swimming pool, or if we didn't do the west wing or whatever, or a change of materials, maybe from a higher grade material to a lower grade material. And those would be considered deducts from the overall. Or we can have the bid price be the sort of more contained element, and then what would it cost to add the pool or add the more expensive siding material or whatever it is. So the concept there is either way, that core element of what the actual bid is, especially if you're doing it as an ad, has to answer the needs of the client to at least enough of an extent that if they actually did go forward, it would be enough of a building for them. But also, importantly, for the exam topic, it also has to still, like, you can't get rid of one of the exit stairs, right? That's sort of an obvious one, but you can imagine lots of scenarios where whatever the add or deduct was would make the building not meet current codes. And so, clearly that can't fly. So the concept here is it has to meet the health, safety, and welfare of the public, but also meet the needs of the client, at least in the sort of primary sense. And then we can adjust the overall, once we have the real numbers, to sort of find a happy medium between what the bids are coming back and what the client actually has budgeted. So a couple of other things to say in terms of A, about being liable. You actually don't have any choice. You actually are not liable, that's really too strong a word, but it is expected that the architect is in conversation with the client about costs from the beginning. In fact, the expectation is that at each of the different phases, so at schematic design, to design development, et cetera, that each of those phases, you would be putting forth your sort of best guess as to what a cost estimate is. So you are already expected to be part of that. So A doesn't really make any sense. It does sound right, though, because there's lots of other things where you don't want to get involved because then you take on liability. So you just want to be clear, the liability issues are generally going to be about the relationship to the contractor. And there's a number of situations where you actually are pretty deeply involved with the owner to the point where you actually, it's referred to as agency. You have agency with the owner, meaning you can speak for the owner, or you can, you're working very closely there. What you do is representative of the owner, that kind of thing. So A doesn't make any sense. Telling the bidders to just bring their costs down, that doesn't make any sense either, because the whole point of the bid is to find out a real number. And if you tell them something like that, all that's going to do is bring the change orders down the road. That's going to make everything not make sense down the road. And D, create the 2 bid forms. I've actually done that before. It's a really, really bad idea. It's, first of all, a huge amount of work. It's very confusing. There's lots of sort of legal, ethical reasons why you shouldn't, like in general, you should not be asking contractors to bid things that they don't really have a chance to win, because it's a lot of work and it's just not ethical. But there are occasionally sort of crazy situations where it just mandates, because of timing, that you do something like that. But the answer from an NCARB standpoint would never be D. Like, it's always about managing the process, not letting the process take over. So C, adds and deducts. Hope that worked well for everybody.
Yeah, a lot of C's,
Excellent. We're going to move on to 2. A couple are a little bit longer than some of these. Number 2, which of the following project delivery methods would be the most logical and cost-effective for a typical town library project? So one of the things you'll find is that as we go through a few of these questions, there's a couple of key words that are really what the question is actually about. And if we were kind of thinking about what those key words were, obviously one of the keys is going to be project delivery. That is a term that you should absolutely feel comfortable with. And project delivery just means what's the manner that the project is going to move forward. So is it design build? Design build would mean that there's one contract between the owner and the designers and builders. So that's a very particular way of doing it. It's a pretty popular way of doing it, but it's still probably only about maybe 15% or 20% of the time, something like that. Another one would be design bid build, which is one of our potential answers. And that's the sort of more classic where owner hires an architect. They go through a very long process of designing and going through schematic design, design development, CDs, and then eventually to the bid process. And then a bidder is chosen, so you have a bid process, and then from there, it's now the contractor's project, and your role is in construction administration, CA. So that's a very long, drawn-out way to deliver a project, but there are certain benefits to that. If you think about just design build compared to design bid build, with design bid build, by the time we actually have a contractor chosen, we have a very clear idea because we've gone through a lengthy design process and sort of vetting all the issues. We've gone through a bidding process, so we now have a very clear set of relationships from multiple bidders. And we can absolutely say, well, out of these bidders, this is the low, this is the high. We get a range of what's possible. All of that level of understanding is sort of puts you in very good stead to know that you're getting a good deal on your project, and then you have to build it out. So those are probably the two most common. Design bid build, definitely closer to 50% of the time. It's by far the most common, and if it's not specifically mentioned, and you're curious about what project delivery method it is, design bid build would absolutely be the assumption. You can see how you start to kind of go through these things and see that, well, okay, so design bid build, the advantage there is I get to know what the low cost is, what the low bid is. Design build, however, the weird thing about design build is I make the deal, if I'm the owner, the client, I make that deal very, very early in the process. And so I have to choose that single entity. The big advantage to the client is when something goes wrong, when there's a dispute, it's one phone call, right? It's one set of relationships. So design build is very useful from that standpoint if you're an owner. But the downside is there's very little, like you haven't designed the whole thing out before you start getting the bids and getting the contractors involved. You're actually doing that before anything's been designed. And so it has certain downsides. It's hard to judge exactly what you're going to get out of it. So certain times design build makes sense, other times design bid build makes sense. And then a couple of other terms that are interesting to note. One would be multiple prime. Multiple prime is interesting because what that's referring to is that I have multiple prime contractors. So that means I don't just have a general contractor. I have, say, 2 or 3 or 4 general contractors. But since not one of them is the overall general contractor, none of them get called that. They all get called prime contractors. So the sort of example to sort of make this hopefully a little more understandable would be, imagine you're a university and you're building a laboratory building. And you have a set of architects that you've been working with, and they've been doing a bunch of university buildings. So you want them, because they're really knowledgeable about the university, and you want them to do the exterior and kind of deal with how it creates a courtyard and how all the walkways work and the landscaping muted back and forth into the building and all of that. But they're not experts in laboratories, and laboratory takes a lot of very specific expertise. So you might have a totally different designer and contractor for the laboratory part. Right, so that would be multiple primes. You can actually get into situations where you might have 3, 4, even 5 different multiple primes. So that's a way of delivering it. Clearly, you would have to do the drawings differently. The contracts would all be different. And so that's what we mean by project delivery. All the systems for how the whole project moves forward are decided once you decide which project delivery way you go. And then some of these other ones, Fast Track and Construction Manager, are other project delivery methods. Fast Track you've probably heard of. It's a classic on questions for the on the NCARB ARE stuff because it's so kind of odd and crazy, but it's known and viable system. It's a pretty rare project delivery though, and the reason for it's pretty rare is because it's kind of crazy and expensive. So Fast Track is when time is of the essence. Could be because you're building a stadium and the football games are going to start in September no matter what. Could be because you're building a school and the kids are going to show up. It could be that you're building a building downtown, so let's say Manhattan or something, and the carrying cost of the land is so expensive that you just want to get the building up and running as fast as possible so you can start making money back. But Fast Track is where it's all about time. And so the way Fast Track works is the architects figure out what the sort of general shape of the building is going to be, and they do an excavation and foundation plan. And then they hand that over to a contractor. The contractor starts building the foundation. While that's happening, the architects are figuring out what the steel frame is going to look like, and then they hand that over to a contractor, and they start building that as soon as the foundation's ready. And while they're erecting all the steel, the architects are now doing what the skin is going to look like. So it's a whole series of different packages, and the building is literally being built while it's being designed. Obviously, that's a stupid way to build a building because you're going to make a lot of mistakes. But if it's really all about time is money, then it can make a lot of sense. So there's a lot of reasons why you might do Fast Track, and it's a really good one for questions, which is why I spend so much time talking about it. But in reality, it's a fairly rare process. You will find a lot of pretty regular projects might have an aspect of them that are fast-tracked, they kind of, for a smaller section where maybe they have to get something done in order to pacify code officials or to meet some other kind of deadline, but then the rest of the project will go in normal. So there's a lot of different ways that these things get combined together, but I don't think they'll be convoluted like that on the exam. And then Construction Manager is the other sort of one that's the big one, and this is pretty much all of them: design, bid, build, Fast Track, Construction Manager, and unlikely one that might come up is that multiple prime. Construction Manager is when, instead of hiring an architect who then goes and does the design and then we bid it out to a lot of different contractors, effectively the construction manager is somebody who's hired by the owner. They hire them in, they become part of the team. They're kind of like an employee. They're not actually employees all the time. Sometimes they are, but they're not always employees. Sometimes it's a contractual thing. But if you think of them like an employee of the owner, you start to understand how it changes the contracts. So instead of having a contract with the owner to the architect and then a separate one with the owner to the contractor, in a construction manager, there's really just the contract that goes between the owner and the architect. So it's sort of shifting around responsibilities, and there's a bunch of advantages to construction manager. The biggest one is that you get their expertise early on in the design process. And the other big advantage to an owner is that the profit that normally would go to a GC, a general contractor, gets taken back in by the owner, so they don't have to pay for that profit. Of course, the flip of that is they're also taking the risk that the general contractors always take. So they can lose their shirts as well as save a bunch of money. Okay, what I said in the beginning was, here's a bunch of things. The project delivery, absolutely going to be part of this exam. You should definitely feel comfortable with all these different terms and how it might start to impact the contracts and the relationships and the timing and all of those things. And when you look at the question, so the first thing there was that the words project delivery, so we know what it's about there. And the second thing here is a town library. So what that's telling us is that this is a This is not a private project. This is not somebody building an office for their business or something like that, which, they can do whatever they want, right? They may realize like, we have some builders we know, we like them, we're just going to go with the design builders that we know or something like that. They can make whatever choices they want. In a town library or a school or any of those sort of infrastructural, municipality-run infrastructural type projects, they have to be able to explain to the taxpayers that they got a good deal. They have to be able to make sure that they can show that they are following all the rules. So in that kind of scenario, the whole design bid build, where we actually are really clear about what the low price is, they don't necessarily have to take the low. There's usually some rules about they have a little bit of flexibility because they may not trust the low. But the fact that it's run for a town is absolutely telling us that the correct answer here is going to be B, design bid build. So all of that to say, make sure you feel comfortable with project delivery, that each of these different ones, they have different, like I said, different contracts, they have different lengths of time, and they have different sort of value in different scenarios. And like all of these things, the point is not to memorize the names. The point is to sort of think of what a topic is and then kind of imagine a question that, put it into a scenario. So that you start understanding the way that they could ask you questions. That's really what you're looking for when you're doing the studying for these things.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like that's something we've learned from talking with the folks at NCARB about how they craft the questions that they write, and you have to be really careful about all the little bits of information, because at a quick glance, sometimes it might make you think one answer is appropriate, but if you look really closely at a couple of the sort of scenarios, as you say, that they're suggesting, and in this case, as you said, the town library project, that changes the context of the question totally, completely.
You flip that word out, like the town grocery store, and it's a totally different answer. You're scanning the questions to see what is the scenario they really mean, and then you're sort of placing these concepts that you've read about and studied or listened to us about, and then you're trying to sort of find the scenario that's the through line of a sort of clear thought about why this one would make the most sense.
We got pretty much everybody got B on that.
Yeah.
Victoria and Anna, we'll come back to your question at the end.
Sounds mysterious. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, number 3, changes in the plan will result in the production of we have A, construction change directive, B, change order, C, addendum, D, depends on timing. All right, so here you go. This is one of those annoying ones that the correct answer is absolutely D. It depends on the timing. And the reason for that is that construction change directive, change orders, and addendums are all changes to the plan that are important and contractual. They're not just changes that you're making in-house and kind of as the drawings get sort of brought up to speed. These are all contractual type of changes, but at different points along the way, they get called different things. So hopefully the word addendum is not a surprise to you, because it's likely to show up. So is change order. So addendum is going to be one of those things where you've done a bid set, you've set out sent the bid information out to the various bidders. They're going to look at that information, and as they start pulling the numbers together, they're bound to have some questions. And so they're going to call you up and ask you a bunch of those questions. And the key thing about during bidding is you never answer the questions. Because if you answer a question somebody asks you, then they now have information that's different from somebody else. And the entire point is that everybody has apples to apples so that the numbers are all directly comparable. But what you do is you take their questions and you assemble in. After a while, you get questions from various different people, and you sort of play it by ear what the logical timeline of the addendum is. But at some point, you say, okay, I've got 7 questions or 10 questions or something. We're going to call it, and we're going to call this an addendum, and it gets numbered and it gets sequenced. And that addendum is, here's the question that we received, here's the answer we're giving. Here's the question we received, here's the answer we're giving. And the addendum is dated and numbered, and it might have general information, it might have contractual information, it might have direct material information. There's all kinds of things that could come up in that. So that's the addendum. It then becomes part of the bid package, so that when the bidders are giving the bids back, it's not just the original bid package, the drawings and the specs, it's also including any and all addendums, so that it becomes part of that. So a major change absolutely would show up and be called an addendum, but only in that period. As soon as a bidder is chosen, we then have a general contractor. This is clearly the delivery method I'm talking about here is design, bid, build. As I said, if it doesn't say a specific delivery method, then you just assume design, bid, build. Once we have a general contractor chosen, once we have a bidder chosen, then a change is a change to the contract. And so when their bid was accepted and the contract was all sort of put together, your drawings, the specifications, the addendums, all that stuff becomes part of the contract between the owner and the contractor. So that's all the contract, and then if something needs to get changed, and it happens all the time, lots of things change, something needs to get changed, you are changing the contract. So that's a change order. And just like a contract, it's going to have the sort of essence of the contract built into it. So the essence of every contract in terms of these kinds of construction contracts is always going to be what's the scope change, what's the dollar change, what's the timeline change. In exactly the same way that your the owner contractor contract, the essence of that contract is what's the scope that we're building, how much are we charging for that, and how long will it take. So that's the essence of the contract always, and every change also has to represent those three parts. So change order, also a totally reasonable answer, but only after a bidder is chosen. And then there's construction change directive, and that's that weird one that if the contractor isn't willing to make the changes, like maybe let's say the contractor's just sort of generally unhappy with things, and you say, okay, we're gonna change from wood shingles to wood shakes, which would be very, very similar to shingles. And the contractor says, okay, $100,000. You're like, that's crazy. It should be $3,000. And the contractor says, I don't care. It's $100,000. This doesn't actually happen all that often, but I'm giving it voices so you kind of understand it, right? So there's some real problem. They're just unhappy and they're trying to kind of screw you. So what do? Well, what you're trying to do is a change order because you want to change the contract. They're not willing to do it at a price point that makes sense. So you would actually issue a construction change directive. And so that's effectively a change order where you're saying, make the change, we're changing the contract, and we will at some point at a later time, either through arbitration or mediation or through some other system that's delineated in the contract, bring in a third party who will make will figure out what a reasonable price would have been, and then we'll go back and pay you that amount of money. So it's a way of doing a change order when there's obstruction. So all three of those are changes to the plan, but they all would depend on timing and situation. So hence D. All right.
Yeah, most people got D, so.
Excellent. Well done.
Nailed it.
Okay. In order to start the building code analysis, the first issue to be clarified would be what? So clearly, programming, planning, and practice, there's going to be a lot of questions that are going to be about zoning codes, building codes, these kind of things that you would need to do analysis of in order to be able to do some planning. You can't just sort of jump into onto a site and just start saying, well, let's put a tower here, right? You would have to kind of figure out, is a tower believable? Is it allowed in that site? Well, same thing would be true from a building code analysis. You need to start having these sort of base ideas about Way before you start getting into, well, how big is the beam or anything like that, you would want to start to understand, well, what's my construction system and how big can I build it before I have to have fire-rated walls, and how many exits am I going to need, and all of those kinds of things. How many bathrooms am I going to need to put in? All of the infrastructural stuff you would be thinking about at this early stage in order to make sure that the plans, when you start to move forward, have a logic about them and can support what's actually going to be allowed on that site. So the first two things that you look at are always going to be the occupancy and the construction system. So the one-word answer is absolutely going to be either occupancy, so I'm just going to say OUCC, or use. It's kind of the same term. You could use either one. But the reason for that is that if you start thinking about, like, imagine you're just starting a project and you're gonna sit down and you're like, well, okay, how big a project can it be? And you're looking at construction systems or something. Well, you can't really look at the construction system tables without understanding what the project is for. For example, if it's for a hospital, clearly they're going to be much more protective. The fire ratings are going to be much higher. The size allowed for before you have to put in another set of exit stairs. All sorts of things are going to get driven by the fact that it's a hospital. And similarly, if it's a, say, storage building or something, it's going to be a whole bunch of things that are just not going to be on the table because it doesn't have very many people in it. There's no expectation that it would have a lot of exiting needs. There's no expectation that you would have other fire rating issues because storage, who knows what people store, but you would have a lot of other sort of flexibility in other uses, in other ways. So you would absolutely always start with occupancy, and then the second thing you would go to would be construction systems, and then from there you start moving into how tall of a building, how big a floor plate, how many bathrooms, all of that kind of stuff. But you would always start with those two things to make sure you're kind of going in the right track. Now, interestingly, because you may not know what construction system, so you start with occupancy, and you might do 2 or 3 different construction systems as an analysis through the building code in order to sort of see where it leads you. And that's always sort of one of those kind of interesting questions when you sort of move through the process, and hopefully one sort of becomes the sort of logical, sort of clear winner in that process. And just while we're talking about these things, one quick thing I want to mention is imagine that you are using this, and you've gone through this process, and you've looked at the occupancy, and you've looked at the construction systems, and it says something like you can build 10,000 square feet per floor for that combination with whatever construction system it is. Let's say it's steel. And your client is really stuck on having 14,000 square feet per floor. So that's my floor plate, 14,000 square feet. And you're trying to figure out what you're going to do. Like, the code says I can only build a 10,000 square foot building per floor, and the client really wants the 14,000. Do I have to go back and tell the client no? Like, what's going on? Well, the answer is you're probably just going to put a building wall down the middle of it. And if there's, say, a corridor that's going through, you're just going to put some doors in there that are held on hold opens, and they just sit wide open. Nobody even really notices that wall is there, and it's probably a 4-hour wall. And so I effectively have 2 buildings. I have one that's, let's say, 4,000 square feet, and one that's, say, 9,000 square feet, and that adds up to the 14. The client's happy, now, except they have to pay for this big building wall, which is very expensive, 4-hour wall. But the point here is the terms are often used in interesting ways. Like, the idea of a building has potentially many meanings when you're going through the building code. It's not just the overall structure. It can mean lots of different things, and you want to start being attuned to how you use the code to be able to make an analysis. Under 5.0, I can guarantee you there's going to be fairly lengthy bits of code, and you're going to have to sort of find the part that is meaningful to this particular question, and then kind of divine from that an answer like what I just gave you. So this is sort of about kind of thinking about the process, occupancy, construction, then all the other construction type, and then all the other ones, but also starting to think about how you use those words and kind of what they mean. So you want to start practicing that stuff as best you can.
Looking good on occupancy.
Excellent. Number 5. Which of the following might be a way to review height limitations in a zoning code? Setbacks, FAR, districts. D, height is controlled by the building code. All right, so the answer here is one that's the best of the answers given. Setbacks really are not going to tell us very much about heights. Setbacks are going to be like side yards, front yards, rear yards. So that's in plan away from the property line. So setbacks in less dense places, more like a single-family residential, will be much bigger. Setbacks in kind of dense urban places might be as little as 0, so that you have the storefront right up to the sidewalk and the buildings just bump right into each other on the side. So setbacks is very important to zoning codes in terms of the density and the feel of a place, but it doesn't really have anything to do with heights. Everything is going to be really understood through districts. Heights, setbacks, parking, everything is, you're going to have residential districts, you're going to have manufacturing districts. And just because I have a residential district doesn't mean I can't have manufacturing in it. It just means that it'll be limited in some way. And just because I have a manufacturing district doesn't mean I can't have residential in it. It just means it'll be limited in some way. So the districts is how you start to, each of these districts will have multiple different pieces of information, setbacks, FAR, all those different things. The only one that is really a potential answer here is going to be B, FAR. And FAR is the floor area ratio. And so that's where I have a site size, and that site, if let's say it's a 10,000 square feet, and if I have an FAR of 1, that means my building can have 10,000 square feet of enclosed space. So I could have a 2-story building where each floor is 5,000 square feet, for example, and that would meet an FAR of 1. So the point of the FAR is to control kind of mass, which is one of the ways to control height. So if you have an FAR, let's say that the 10,000 square feet site, and we have an FAR that is, say, 2, that means I can build a 20,000 square foot building. Well, just like the example I just gave, I could build a 5,000 square foot floor plate and have 4 floors, and that would give me 20,000 square feet, and I would be maxing out my FAR. But in that process, I'm essentially saying that the smaller the footprint, the taller it can be. The larger the footprint, the shorter it can be. So it's a way of controlling the sort of mass of a building, which includes the height. And I could build a very small footprint and have it go much higher if there wasn't any other height restriction. A lot of zoning codes won't have any other height restriction other than the FAR. Some will have both, some will only have height restrictions. So there's a lot of different ways that it can be done, but FAR is definitely one of those concepts you should feel comfortable with. It's likely to show up, that along with PUD, planned unit development, a few other things that are these sort of zoning code issues, and you should feel comfortable with those terms. Height is absolutely controlled in the building code, although never as a, this is the absolute height limit you can build. It's almost always, I shouldn't say never, I'm sure there are situations where it does do that, but if typically what a building code will say is, given this occupancy and this construction system, here's a height limit. And one of those construction systems, maybe a poured in place concrete or something, will have no limit. You can build whatever you want because it's very unlikely to burn, it's very unlikely to have any real problems. So there is no building code height limit on it. So the building codes will limit things according to use and construction systems. All right, moving on. Number 6, your hotel client is looking for you to provide a very preliminary estimate for the construction cost in order to have a number to use in the fee negotiations. Which system would you likely use? Statutory method, unit-based pricing, square foot pricing, assemblies method. I'm going to tell you right off, something you're not really supposed to do in these things. I just made up statutory method. So that's not a real thing. Sorry.
Good. I was worried that was a real thing that I'd never heard of.
Yeah, I had Mark worried that it was something he'd never heard before. So the potential answers are B, C, or D. And again, this is one of those ones where you want to look through the question and see what are the key pieces of information. So it may not seem like it's that key, but one of them is hotel. Because a hotel is a very particular kind of typology. The other thing you're noticing here is the word preliminary. So this means nothing has been designed yet. You're not in a situation where you have a lot of drawings to kind of think about. You have a hotel, very repetitive. There's a whole bunch of similar rooms. The construction system is probably pretty much based on the fact that it's a hotel. So there's this very specific set of ways of building and ways of thinking about how hotels work that are sort of ingrained in the way that these things tend to move forward. And we haven't designed anything yet. We're at the preliminary spot. So the answer to this question is likely to be unit-based. And what the unit is a hotel room. So the kinds of places this might show up would be, say, a school, where I have a school with 30 classrooms, or a hotel with 500 beds, or anything that has that kind of very repetitive element, and that there's a very clear set of relationships. If I have a hotel with 30 beds, I'm going to have a much smaller admin area. I'm going to have a much smaller laundry area. I'm going to have a much smaller restaurant that goes with that. If I'm going to have a hotel with 500 or 1,000 beds, I'm going to have a much bigger restaurant. I'm going to have a much bigger laundry. I'm going to have a whole wing that's admin. So there's going to be a very clear relationship of the things that aren't rooms to the number of rooms. And so you can fairly easily kind of look up in the various books and say, all right, typical construction of a hotel room is X amount, and that would include the room plus its percentage of the other stuff. Same with schools, same with any of those repetitive elements. Now, if this was not a hotel, then I very likely would be saying square foot pricing, because like typically in that situation, I'd be making my best guess as to how big I thought something would be in the preliminary, and then I'd be multiplying it by a square footage cost that seems reasonable, like $200 a square foot or $250 a square foot for sort of new construction. So that I'd have to come up with what I thought the square footage was, even though we haven't designed it yet, in order to then multiply it by a kind of known kind of set of numbers that seem reasonable out in the world. So square foot pricing would be a totally reasonable answer. It's just that because of the hotel, I would go with unit-based pricing because it makes more sense for this specific situation. Assemblies method, that's farther down the road. That's when you're in the situation where you've got a design, you're going through design development, you know that it's going to be CMU backup with a insulation and an air gap, and then a 4-inch brick in front of it. And, like, you know enough about the building that you can actually figure out what the assemblies are basically like, and then you can do linear foot calculations per assembly and then add it all together. But there's no way you could do that at a preliminary moment. You just don't have enough information. All right, moving on. All right, this one's going to make various people angry. So I apologize for those who did this. I specifically made this kind of a ridiculous question because I just wanted to get to a spot where we could talk about what people mean when they talk about pricing. So, all right, your client jubilantly tells you they have $1 million to spend, or I should say that in caps, $1 million to spend on this exciting new construction project. what number should you hear? So, all right, what am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is, and this is something that's specifically an issue, especially for young designers who are really excited to get their first big project. You should absolutely not hear the word 1 million. That construction cost is going to be way, way less than that. Sort of typical numbers on these things is roughly a 2/3 to 1/3. So, and I'll go through some different ranges as well, but where I might have, say, 2/3 might go to the hard costs, and hard costs would be construction, for example, and 1/3 would go to the soft costs. And the soft costs might be bridge loans, lawyers, getting the zoning changed in order to get the process to move forward. I have all these lawyers involved. It might include land acquisition. If the land is very expensive, it's going to dramatically alter this 2/3, 1/3 scenario. So there's a whole series of things that you are likely to have to pay for out of that $1 million. So in actuality, your number might be, let's say, 667,000, which would be the 2/3 number. But if we had more information, it could be even quite different from that. And then, so let's say I'm going to put let's say 667,000. So that's our 2/3 number. So what does that include? Well, it depends on what the building is, obviously, and we don't have enough information in here to say anything different from the 2/3 number. But it may well be that that number includes both the hard costs of the shell and core of the building, so the actual like construction of the building, that if all hell breaks loose and whatever it is goes out of business is still going to stay there. But then they also have to pay somehow they have to pay for the F, F, and E, which is going to be the furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So FF and E has to come out of somewhere, and it would depend on the kind of project, that depending on how much that might be. So FF and E for, say, a commercial kitchen might be actually quite high. It might be half of the money or even more of the overall project, because the equipment is so expensive. The furnishings for, let's say you're doing a lawyer's office in an existing loft building, where you may be moving a few walls around, putting in some glass walls for a conference room, something like that. But there's really probably not that much architecture. It's probably a lot of mechanical, and it's probably a lot of furniture. They're going to spend a lot of money making that place look really sharp, and maybe an art budget, something like that. So these budgets break out in all sorts of different ways. So I'm gonna tell everybody here, like, they should pretty much accept any number as long as it's lower than $1 million, because you will never have the full amount for your construction unless they say this is for the hard costs, this is for the construction.
I think that's awesome that you're working for their t-shirts, man. That's good.
That's right. I'm looking out for you guys, trying to get you a t-shirt.
I will tell you, though, that I think we're down to 2 people out of 50 who have everything right so far.
Cool.
So, and that stands.
All right, number 8, moving right along. The architect's fee is often calculated using a percentage of the overall construction cost. Right? It's sort of one of the typical ways. There's a bunch of ways you can do it. You can also calculate the fees by just figuring out how many hours it takes. Back in the old days, we would think of it as sheets, because you literally drew each sheet, and you would actually start to say, well, this is going to take 20 sheets, and each sheet is worth X amount of time, therefore we'll charge this much for the project. These days, things, because it's so easy to manipulate them, you don't really think of things in sheets anymore in that same way, so you wouldn't really use that. You would use probably an hourly guess, something along those lines. So there's a bunch of ways you can do it, but one of the old tried and true ones is thinking of it as a percentage of the overall construction cost. So we have a couple of potential answers here. Typically about 10% would go to the architect of the overall construction cost. B would be smaller projects typically have smaller percentages. C is residential projects typically have smaller percentages, and D, larger projects typically have smaller percentages. The 10% is not a bad sort of typical, but it's a little high. And let me run through the other ones just to kind of be clear. Let's look at C first. So when you start thinking about a residential project, it depends obviously on what kind of residential project. Is it spec residential, or is it for a specific family? But residential is a lot of detail. There's a lot of people are going to live there. They really want to know about like how their place is going to work. So residential, actually, the percentages usually go up a little bit. There's a lot of walls, there's a lot of understandings, a lot of egress issues. There's a lot of very specific issues you have to be very careful about. So C is definitely not right, because for residential projects, the percentage actually is a little bit bigger usually for the same scale of project. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Like I said, 10%, a little high, so it's not A. So then the question is B or D. Smaller projects typically have smaller percentages, or larger projects typically have smaller percentages. And the answer is D. And the reason for that is that, let's think of it as a small office versus a big office, or a small house versus a big house. Let's do house. It's probably easier to picture. So you have a small house. That small house still has a bathroom, and still has a kitchen, and it still has a front door and siding materials, and it still has a roof-to-wall relationship, and it still has a basement maybe, and like the way that the walls of the foundation meet the walls of the thing. It has, even if it's small, it has all the difficult things in it. You're going to spend a lot of time thinking about the kitchens and how the bathrooms work, all of that. Whereas a larger house is still going to have a kitchen. It might have multiple bathrooms, but there's still going to be a sort of bathroom. It's still going to have the way the wall meets the roof. It's still going to have all those same issues. So as the project gets smaller, I can't just keep doing it as a percentage off. Like at some point, it gets smaller. It actually takes more of a percentage to get it all to work. So smaller projects, the percent actually goes up. Larger projects, the percent goes down. So for example, if you're doing a single family house, you might be doing it for like a custom house. You might be doing that single family custom house anywhere from say 12% up to 15, 16% of the construction cost. If you're Rem Koolhaas or somebody like that, it's probably 20%, but for the rest of us, 15 is probably about the maximum you'll ever get. So that's a pretty reasonable percentage out of that. But let's say, okay, you're not doing that. Let's say instead it's 100 units of housing. Well, that 100 units of housing, you're probably getting something more like 2%. Because it's bigger and you're getting a lot of the ability to do a couple of different kitchens and then use them for all 100 units. You're doing a few bathrooms and then using them for all the units. So you're able to get the economy of scale, and so people just aren't going to be willing to pay you that same percentage number. So D, larger projects typically have smaller percentages. All right, number 9. In understanding the likely success of a small commercial strip mall project, which of the following should be considered? A, catchment area, B, amenity study, C, easement review, D, zoning review. Well, for any project, I'm going to want to know about the easements. Easements are kind of like zoning restrictions, but they are not from a government entity. They are things that follow the deed, so they're maybe a utility line goes through or something like that, and there's some contract was made in order to let that utility line go through, and that contract rides with the deed, so that if I sell the land, the person who buys the land from me also has to live up to the easement contract. So easements are important, but they don't really have anything to do with the success of a strip mall. Zoning review, well, clearly any project is only going to be successful if you have done a reasonable zoning review. But that's not really like what the question is getting at. Really, it comes down to A or B, amenity study and catchment area. Amenity study would be something like, all right, you're doing housing in a specific city, in a specific neighborhood. and or specific, maybe a suburb, how about? Should you be designing pools for that housing? Like, does everybody expect that they should be able to get a pool? That would be an amenity that would be, you would have gone through and studied, like, what do people expect? What's the market like? Does the market support? So amenity studies are about these kind of things that have to do with market studies and amenity levels, and might be about condos, or it could even be about strip malls and things in terms of parking or something, but it's not the big question that you would be wondering about. The answer is going to be A, catchment area. And catchment actually comes from a water term. So if you think of a catch basin, the water that goes to a catch basin is the catchment for that catch basin. So it's a big area that drains towards something. So if you're talking about, like, in a parking lot, you might have a catchment that captures all the water into one specific catch basin. If you're talking about New York City, then the Catskill Mountains are the catchment area for the water that they collect and then use to have potable water in the city. So the word catchment can be used in lots of different ways in terms of water, but then somewhere along the way it got usurped and used for kind of highest and best use and kind of figuring out what makes sense for different projects. So the catchment would be, for this strip mall, who would be going to this? Who would want to go to this strip mall? Is there a market there of people who would get to that? Does it make sense? Is it likely to be a success? So the easiest way to think about this is like a corner store. For those of you who live in a city, think about how many blocks would you walk to go to a corner store? Maybe 2 blocks, 3 blocks, something like that. Maybe you like walking 4 or 5 blocks. But by the time you get to 5, 6, 8 blocks, you're not going to go to a corner store. You're going to go to a full-fledged grocery store, because really, why would you pay the extra amount and walk that far if you can? By the time you're going to a certain distance, you're just going to go to a different thing, right? So there's a pretty limited catchment for that corner store, right? And so it becomes very important to understand, well, how many people live in that place? So hopefully that makes sense. All right, number 10. Your house client has certain restrictions on their site that include exterior siding materials, slope of the roof, and permitted uses for exterior spaces. Where are these restrictions likely from? Well, we just talked about easements, and it doesn't really seem to make sense from that standpoint. Zoning department, there are a few examples. I remember like Aspen and places like that have a lot of that kind of stuff in their zoning, but the vast majority of zoning wouldn't get into that kind of level of detail. Market study would be potentially interesting. It's kind of like amenities stuff that we just talked about, but the actual answer here is covenants. So that's a word that's worth knowing. Covenants are when a private development, think of it as like a gated community, and all the houses are all brick, or all the houses are clapboard siding, and they all have pitched roofs, no flat roofs, or something like that. That means they're following the covenant. So it's it's writing with the deed. So it's something that you would have to respond to. You can't just ignore a covenant because it's contractual, but it's not from the zoning code. It's not a municipality-run thing. So covenant, that shows up often on these kinds of exams. Okay, we got one last bonus one here. This is directly from one of the NCARB ones, and I just put this in here because this is totally the kind of thing that they are likely to ask in some form, and so I just want to make sure you don't forget this part of it. All right, the most appropriate strategy for predicting and preventing conflicts between the architectural and engineering documents is to hold regular coordination meetings. I do love the idea of having the owner review the drawings. That would be pretty amusing, but the answer is absolutely A, that they want you to regularize the process so that there's a clear way for people to see what the issues are, to understand each other's agendas, so that everything can kind of meld together. So for a bigger project, you might be doing it every 2 weeks for the whole process of schematic and maybe early design development, and then maybe a little bit less than that through construction documents, and then a lot again when you're getting the coordination worked out. In other situations, for a smaller project, it might be just 2 important meetings, something for a house or something like that. So what regular means is really dependent on the situation. but the idea that you're creating a system of communication is hugely important. And that's absolutely something that NCARB and AIA would want you to be thinking about. You're looking for information on that kind of thing, check out the professional handbook, the Architect's Professional Handbook that's produced by AIA, because they'll talk about those kinds of issues in there pretty clearly. All right, how do we do?
Awesome. So we're down to 2 lucky winners here. Looks like we have Kristen L. and Robert P. You two made it all the way to the end.
Way to go, Kristen and Robert.
100%. Looks like, I think it was that question, let's see, which was it? Question 6 here that really sort of got everybody. So we have a ton of questions here. Maybe we'll take 2 of them here before we head out. Let's see here. Let's grab a good one. This is from Lori H. She says, "Isn't occupancy and use considered part of the zoning of the building? Why use one specific word instead of the broader term in that question? Where are you allowed both occupancy and use to be?"
The reason that I'm sort of loose about using those 2 terms is that in different codes they'll use occupancy, in other codes they'll use use, but also in a lot of the guidebooks they'll kind of use them interchangeably. Effectively, like you'll find that one code will use one of those words, and so you'll whatever that code is, you'll follow that, use that word. But the gist of it is the idea behind it, which is what is the building for? How will it actually be used? Because it impacts everything. It impacts egress, it impacts placement on the site, it impacts the relationship to the construction systems. It is the driver of, from a code standpoint, of everything. Any code reviewer, the first thing they're going to look for is what's the use.
Awesome. And then going back to question number 2, here's a question. Working on school projects, there are cases when there's a construction manager and the project is still put through a design, bid, build process. Why would construction manager not be the correct answer, when one of the items in the question is calling for the most cost-effective project delivery?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that actually is true, but that's a more specific. We could also go through there's a number of municipalities that are testing ideas about doing design build as a way to save money, as a way to reduce levels of oversight that they have to do. There's a bunch of ways that people are trying out different things, but the vast majority of the projects like that are going to be pretty straightforward design, bid, build. And part of the reason that there's a little bit of confusion on that is the term construction manager. Occasionally, it will be exactly like what you just said, that the construction manager will be, in fact, a construction manager that's hired in order to help bring in important information early on into the process. But the cost effectiveness would still be the fact that you were able to bid it out to multiple bidders. So the construction manager would be there, but the real issue for the cost effectiveness, to know that you have something that's cost effective, is because of design, bid, build. But then the second part of that is you'll have a lot of people who are called construction managers, but they're actually like working for the facilities end of the municipality or something. And so they are managing the construction, but they are not necessarily contractual construction managers in that sort of typical CM contract sort of way. So it's a really good question, and it's absolutely true, but remember, the point here is not to find the little examples where you can kind of get in between things. Is what's the gist of what's going on? They're sort of expecting you to kind of have a general understanding, and in this case, it's about price, it's about municipal process. There's going to be a whole series of things that are going to come up that are all about design, bid, build. And in fact, the bids are probably going to be sealed bids. There's going to be a whole process to it. But occasionally there'll be other versions of that.
Awesome. All right, well, we're going to close it up there. So thank you, Mike. Thanks to everybody who've tuned in and submitted your questions today. Really a lot of good questions. If you'd like to attend our next ARE live broadcast where we feature recently licensed architects and their stories about how they passed all 7 exams, if you visit blackspectacles.com/podcast to register. And just like today's episode, you'll have a chance to ask questions and share your thoughts with Mike in the group for live feedback during the broadcast. To learn more about our ARE exam prep curriculum, go to blackspectacles.com where you can try out any of the free course videos. And for those of you who are ready to start preparing for the ARE, and if you've already an AIE member, you can use coupon code 52516 PPP Live to get a 15% discount for the entire duration of your ARE exam prep membership. We've already talked about who won the free t-shirts. I did mention at the beginning that we were going to be giving out a free unlimited 1-month membership, and so let's do that. We had 50 folks who submitted their questions before noon today. So on our famous random.org website here, we're going to generate a number, and let's see who we have as our winner. Go ahead and hit it.
23.
So 23. Who was number 23? 23 was, Lori H., who asked a couple of good questions today. So Lori,
way to go, Lori!
Congratulations. You've won a free ARE and a software tutorial membership for 1 month. So congratulations. We'll be sharing an email with you as well as the folks who won the free t-shirts later today or probably tomorrow morning. And just a reminder to everybody else, thank you for sending in your mock exam questions, and just make sure that you submit your answers before that noon central deadline next time, so you can be entered into our drawing for the next session. And for those of you who are ready to start preparing for the ARE, and if you're already an AIE member, you can use coupon code 52516 PPPTW to get a 15% discount for the entire duration of your ARE prep membership. And then finally, please leave a comment below the video to let us know what you think and share any suggestions you may have. I promise we'll read every word that you write and use them to tune our next episodes. So thanks for watching.